Hi class, today I want to focus your attention for a few minutes on the root causes of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. There is no exact date for the Industrial Revolution like there is for the French or Mexican revolutions. One could certainly make an argument we are still living in the midst of the Industrial Revolution as my lecture comes to you via computers. The Industrial Revolution began slowly in the 1700s, and as new breakthroughs in production occurred, people gradually came to realize the importance of at least some of the new technology for their own lives. Most nations, provinces, and colonies were not thinking about how to speed up the production of handcrafted goods at this time. Most people on the planet were too busy producing enough crops to sustain their families for the winter or dry months and making the handcrafts considered essential to life, like containers in which to hold water. They had not the time, energy, or money to invest in thinking, how do I do this faster and more efficiently? They simply continued to do things the way their parents and grandparents had taught them. So the question for today is, what characteristics did people have to possess in order to think it was a better way to learn to mass produce goods using machines rather than using the physical labor around them? Each country would adopt industrialization at its own pace, but there were certain qualities any nation had to possess to begin the process. Another question that fits in its first into the first is, why was it Great Britain that had so many of these qualities and therefore took such an early lead in the industrialization? A nation's connections to the commercial revolution in part determined when they began to question whether they were better ways to produce manufactured goods. The commercial revolution is a term used often to explain the development of colonial trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. As Europeans moved westward the hemisphere, the coast of Africa, and trading centers in Asia, they wanted and needed consumer goods from home, like textiles, hardware, firearms, and good fast ships. In order to produce these goods, they had to produce something in their new surroundings that Europeans wanted. Those in the Western Hemisphere produced cocoa, coffee, tobacco, and sugar. Those in Africa extracted ivory, slaves, and gold. Those in India and China shipped silks, spices, and tea. Those involved in the trade of these goods became very wealthy. Many of these wealthy businessmen eventually made their way back to Europe and sought their way to invest their money in new ventures. The ability of the British to establish economic strongholds in the Western Hemisphere and in India meant lots of very wealthy British citizens who in turn funded the construction of these first factories in England. Another requirement for the industrialization was the nation's ability to extract raw materials from the land. Raw materials are those goods that are grown or dug out of the ground. A nation had to have enough food to feed its people before part of its population could start working in the non-agricultural arenas. A nation also had to have access to the metals, ores, and other organic materials found in ground. For example, the steam engine invented in 1702 to pump water out of mine shafts requires coals that are lit to produce the heat that turns water into steam. Without coal, no one would have invented the steam engine, and others would not have wondered, hey, how can I make this engine work to move things like machines and trains? Great Britain had begun digging for coal in its hill country long before many other areas of Europe, and as the island nation had cut down much of its available forest for housing and ships, it needed other combustible materials to heat homes. By 1789, Great Britain miners extracted 10 million tons of coal a year. While most went to heat homes, increasing amounts went into moving the factory machines. Again, those who figured out quickly the money that could be made in opening new mines in both Great Britain and along its colonies made millions of dollars, and some of that went to invest in the next big thing. In order for them to do that, they needed to support their government. Government officials had to be willing to think of future financial rewards than immediate gain. This meant decreasing taxes on raw materials coming into their countries that might help boost an emerging industry, while raising taxes on imported goods made by other countries in order to produce home industries. Governments also had to be willing to allow what Adam Smith called the invisible hand to work in the economy. In the past, monarchs determined what could be produced, where, and how much, as well as what could be imported and exported. Now they had private companies and their investors to preserve the consumer demands and find ways to supply them. Great Britain in the late 18th century had the lowest taxes of all other European nations, thanks to a small standing army and less foreign debt. The king, his ministers, and parliament also began to realize that investments now could reap larger rewards through taxes collected once the businesses had come to prosper. Until government's leaders could accept laissez-faire economic policies, industrialization could not develop. Even with the government support, industrialization could not flourish with tinkerers. Some professionals and degrees in sciences, but mostly individuals who felt free to challenge conventional wisdom and believed that anything could be created if one could come up with an idea and had enough time to test their experiments. Many of these investments were members of the bourgeoisie, well-educated members of the middle class with spare time on their hands and disposable income they could spend on spare parts and materials. They had learned from the Enlightenment the importance of an individual's ability to reason and science to solve a problem. Once they had created and tested inventions, many proved to be frugal businessmen, holding on to their patents until the right buyer came along, and then putting their profits into the next project or their own manufacturing businesses. Again, thanks to commercial revolution, Great Britain had a relatively large middle class, educated at fine English universities, and willing to devote their spare time to the process of creating machines that could improve the speed of production. And finally, if you're going to create machines and spend money to build factories, you need an ample supply of workers who have no other means of supporting their families and minimal to no education or skill that would enable them to find better employment. In order for these new manufacturing plants to survive, owners needed to be able to sell their goods cheaper than their handmade equivalent, let's say a shirt. In order to produce enough shirts to make a profit, the machines had to turn out a profit or reasonable quality or low price that required having a large labor pool desperate for any kind of work at any wage. If you think back to the beginning of this lecture, you will recall that I said that most people were farmers working small plots of land to feed their families. As long as regions and nations needed most of their population in the field producing food crops, there was not a large enough labor force to man factories as well. In England, however, many landowners began to realize that in the 17th century that traditional farming did not produce huge crops given the climate in England. What England had was colonies that could produce abundant and varied food crops like potatoes, corn, and beans that could be shipped to England to feed its populace. So the question for landowners was not what to do with the land if not cost effective to produce crops. Many decided their property was much better suited to livestock grazing. A herd of cattle could generate significant revenue from dairy products, and meat and sheep provided meat and wool, all of which fetched a better price at market than their grain crops had. This shift from food crops to grazing land is known as enclosure movement. So long as landowners grew their food crops, they had employed many farmers and their families to grow crops in traditional strips of land alongside their families who lived by. If the landowner enclosed their property, they evicted most of the people off their land, keeping only a few who were needed to herd the livestock. Between 1714 and 1820, owners enclosed more than 6 million acres of English countryside. Hundreds of thousands of peasants began moving around England looking for work. The factory was the only choice, so there was little they could do when employers refused to pay a living wage. Entire families went to work in the factory in order to make enough to provide for their basic needs.